Good afternoon. I'm Diane Bystrom, and I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska and also a member of the Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau. It's my pleasure to welcome our viewers today for Humanities Nebraska third in a four-part series on valuing the vote. I invite those on Facebook Live to put in your location in the comments and also to put questions in the comments throughout the program. The Valuing the Vote series program is made possible through a grant that Humanities Nebraska received from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation as part of its Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation initiative. The Mellon Foundation is awarding nearly $2 million in grants to states' humanities councils across the nation to implement programming under this initiative. Humanities Nebraska chose the theme Valuing the Vote to discuss with Nebraskans that the right to vote, to right to cast our vote, has been expanded in our country's history, often through blood, sweat, and tears, and that it requires our continued watchfulness and participation as citizens. Again, this is the third of our four-part series focused on women fighting for the right to vote, which was achieved 100 years ago with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. You can watch recordings of today's program, as well as earlier programs on the Humanities Nebraska Facebook page or the YouTube channel. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sally Bisson-Best. Sally is a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha and the University of Nebraska College of Law. She served as a professor and a director of legal studies at the College of St. Mary's in Omaha from 1992 till recently retiring in May of 2020. She's a published author, and she also speaks at conferences and to community groups about legal careers, women's legal rights, and of course the women's suffrage movement. We look forward to learning more about suffrage leader with Nebraska roots, Doris Stevens, in today's presentation. Sally, the floor is yours.
Okay. Is it showing? Are the PowerPoint slides showing?
Yes.
Okay. And here we go. All right, I have audio, I have video. Thank you so much, Diane, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be speaking to you today. The title of my presentation is Doris Stevens, Omaha's Forgotten Suffrage Leader. I need to express appreciation. The way that I was able to do all the research that I did about Doris Stevens was through a sabbatical from my former employer at the College of St. Mary's. So I always give thanks to them. Students in my first year seminar courses, because they are the reason that I found this subject. The Omaha Public Library branch, Saddlebrook branch, that's very close to my house. When I was on sabbatical, it was in the winter, and I discovered that if I didn't have a place to go, I could do my research at home through the, I could search the database for the Omaha World Herald, which was one of my main sources, but I wasn't very motivated. I was sort of in my fuzzy slippers and watching, daytime television like The Price is Right. So I thought, okay, I need more structure. So I went to the Saddlebrook branch of the library, which was a great structure. The Sewell Belmont House, I did go to Washington, D.C. and do some research. There's a picture of the home in the bottom right-hand corner. It houses the records of the National Women's Party. It's right next to the Senate office building. If you know D.C., you can see it to the right of the brick house there. If you're ever in DC, go to this site. It's now run by the National Park Service, and it's absolutely fascinating to go there. You can see the banners that the suffragists used when they picketed the White House. There are index cards where they wrote down information that they needed when they were lobbying senators and congressmen. So it's a great place to go. And then I always thank my family, friends, and colleagues who helped me with all of this along the way. So who was Doris Stevens? I would say she was a person of great stature that very few people knew about before I started doing this. So she was born in Omaha and graduated from Central High School, which was called Omaha High School, in 1905. She attended Oberlin College, which made a lot of sense. They were the first college to admit women. And she was very musical. And so going to Oberlin was a natural fit for her. She was trained as a teacher and social worker and did work in that field briefly, but mostly worked for women's suffrage and just women's equal rights. In addition to the passage of the 19th Amendment, she wrote a book called Jailed for Freedom, I'll talk more about later. After the 19th Amendment passed, she worked internationally for women's equality. She was an artist and a musician, and we'll get to some of her compositions near the end of my presentation. And interestingly, her estate endowed the first chair in women's studies at Princeton in 1985 with a gift of $1 million. She actually died in the early 60s. And she tried to establish this women's studies. She said that needed to be a recognized academic field. She tried to establish that at Radcliffe. And her personal papers are stored at Radcliffe, but they weren't interested. They didn't want to do it. So I don't know why it took until the mid 80s, because she'd been dead quite a while, but her estate did establish the first endowed chair in women's studies at Princeton with a gift of $1 million, and it is still being awarded today. So there's the paperback copy of Jailed for Freedom on the right-hand side. If you're interested in reading that book, and it is a good read, I would get this copy of it. It's the edited version that came out in the mid 90s. I discovered Doris because I was asked to teach a first-year seminar course. It was a 1-credit course that we ask all of our freshman students to take, and the subject of the course is up to the professor. And so I inherited it about 2 weeks before school was going to start, and all it said was women in the law. There was no textbook, there were no teaching materials. And if you've ever taught before, you would know that that's the kind of thing where you're like, okay, no textbook, no materials, 2 weeks to go. What am I going to do? So I thought, if it's completely up to me, the passage of the 19th Amendment is probably where I'll start, because that was the seminal event from a legal perspective, in my opinion, that gave women many of the rights that we have today. Through that research to get ready for the course, I discovered a documentary called Iron-Jawed Angels, also based on a book by the same name, focused on the last year or so of the suffrage movement, and then Jailed for Freedom, which was written by Doris Stevens. In the Iron-Jawed Angels documentary, the focus is the women who were picketing and arrested at the White House. And in the index to the book, Jailed for Freedom, the names and hometowns of everyone who's arrested were listed. And I was thumbing through the index, reading it. The vast majority of the people who were active in the movement were from the East Coast. Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, but Doris Stevens jumped off the page because it said Doris Stevens, Omaha, Nebraska. I found out that she lived in New York for much of her adult life, but she maintained her ties to her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska in general. So the two focuses, two things that I decided to research were what part of her Nebraska upbringing influenced her work, and then how did we lose her? Because usually if you're from the Midwest, especially Nebraska, we tend to keep track of our native people and find out what has become of them, especially if they have a life of notoriety and significance like Doris did. Her influence, in addition to writing the Jailed for Freedom book, was that she really, I think, put a light on the dark corners of what happened during the picketing of the White House. I attended an all-girls high school. So I'm in my mid-60s. I attended an all-girls high school. My mom was a high school history, social studies teacher, and so I was sort of indoctrinated in a lot of women's history my entire life. I went to law school and I taught at a women's college. And before I started reading about this, I had no idea that women were incarcerated, force-fed with tubes down their noses, and a lot of other really surprising, shocking things for us to get the right to vote. And so it was moving to me to watch the Iron-Jawed Angels movie for the first time about 15 years ago. And it really became a passion of mine to make sure that all of my students were very aware of what this group of women did in order to get us the right to vote. And hopefully, College of St. Mary's is very small, so I used to have about 20 to 25 students in this class every year. I taught it for about 10 or 15 years. So I figured there are at least 250 to 300 young women who graduated from the College of St. Mary who took this course. I really hope that they are registered to vote and they vote. They all promised me that they would. And so I think it's a story that really needs to be shared with all generations. And that was sort of my part for it. So, as already mentioned, Iron Jawed Angels was, it's produced by HBO, is on DVD. I think you can still get it if you ever get a chance. In the picture that I have below, you can see that Alice Paul is portrayed by Hilary Swank. And so she is just to the left of the Mr. President, How Long Must Women Wait for Liberty? To the right, the woman holding the purple, gold, and white banner, which were the colors of the suffrage movement. That is the actress who played Doris Stevens in the movie. I didn't pick up, because she doesn't say her name very often, but after watching the movie for 8 or 10 years, the actress playing Doris Stevens, I didn't make the connections that that was the Doris Stevens who wrote the book, who was the person from Omaha. So it took a little while to put it all together. I mentioned before that she did international work after passage of the 19th Amendment. This is a less than flattering photo of her, but it's her passport photo. It's always, as someone who grew up doing research, with card catalogs and digging in libraries, I'm still always amazed what you can find on the internet. So Doris Stevens' passport photo is on the right. She worked for women's equality in other countries, including trying to get a treaty passed in France. She was arrested in France and London. She also worked in Havana, Cuba. She was best known probably for being the leader of a commission that I mentioned at the bottom of the page that dealt with the legal status of women in the Western Hemisphere. So let's go back to where it all started. So she was born in Omaha in the 1880s into a middle-class family of 4 children. Her parents I think the best way to explain her parents would be that they were a complete mismatch, but she was very heavily influenced by both of them. I have the address of her Omaha home and a picture of the church that she attended, the Low Avenue Presbyterian Church. That building is still standing. Her house is no longer standing, it's a vacant lot. But the Low Avenue Presbyterian Church is no longer a church, but the building is still standing. Her parents were Republicans and they were very politically active, but they really encouraged Doris to find her voice and to be heard. Their marriage, though, deeply affected her. One of the stories that she related was about their mismatch. Her dad was kind of a dreamy, float from job to job kind of guy. Her mother, on the other hand, had aspirations to be a doctor. And we probably all know that that really wasn't something available to women in her mother's generation. And she quotes her mother in some of her papers. She quotes her mother as saying, I was a happy, carefree girl with goals in my life. And then I met your father. So it's kind of painful to hear. But I think her later, what I would call avant-garde views on marriage were very affected by the very sort of unhappy union of her parents. When she was in high school, it's called Central High now, but it was Omaha High School. Another fortunate thing, Central High School, their newspaper and their yearbooks are all available digitally. So at the bottom of the page, you can see her high school graduation photo. And she went by Dora then, which is kind of interesting. It's not easy to read, but the quote at the bottom says, "She vows that her heart is a wide open book. I fancy therein I should much like to look and read there the secrets of short tete-a-tetes of church Sunday evenings and some other dates." She was an editor of the newspaper, considered very flirty and popular. I was able to read some of the articles that she wrote in her high school newspaper, and it's not surprising that she did later write quite a bit because she had an affinity for it even in her high school years. This is a cartoon from that yearbook from the class of 1905, which I think is fascinating. At the bottom, it says, "Looking into the future." So this is what girls in the class of 05 were being told to do. On the far left, you've got a girl in a cap of gown. In the middle, getting older with going out somewhere, a hat. On the right, it looked like maybe a formal gown. On the bottom in the middle, it looks like a wedding gown. Next To me, it looks like a kimono, and I have no idea what that's supposed to be. And then finally on the right is sort of the elderly person. And so this is the type of thing that girls were supposed to be looking forward to. And to say that Doris took a different path is quite an understatement. She got to college after graduating from Central High School, Omaha High School. And when she arrived at Oberlin, this is how she described herself. She said she had a scholarship and she took with her a rifle to shoot jackrabbits, $22 borrowed from her brother, and an aversion to fudge parties. A couple months ago, I did this presentation via Zoom, and I mentioned in that presentation, I didn't know what a fudge party was, and someone in the audience did. Apparently fudge parties were common at this time. Young girls, women would get together, everyone would bring a different flavor or recipe of fudge, and they would sit around and talk about a particular topic. She apparently didn't like doing that, but fudge parties. She got reprimanded for riding in a surrey with a boy after hours, which is not too surprising because she was considered very flirty and popular. She did join the College Equal Suffrage League, and that is her first exposure to the suffrage topic. In her Oberlin yearbook, you can see the quote, "The day has passed when we form an ideal of a man and then hunt for one like it to fall in love with." So the beginnings of her feminist views. While she was in college, I should add, she did meet Sylvia Pankhurst. And the Pankhursts were what I call sort of the bad girls of the British suffrage movement. They were very controversial. Rather than talk about what they wanted to do, they would do things like throw bricks through Parliament windows. They would get arrested trying to rappel the gate and to talk to the king. So the Pankhursts had the motto of deeds, not words. And Alice Paul and Lucy Burns knew them and were very influenced by them. And that is how they brought a more activist methodology to the suffrage movement back here in the US. And so Sylvia Pankhurst, who's the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, the matriarch of the British family, came to Oberlin and spoke, and that really inspired Doris as well. Doris was covered in the local media. This is something that I really wanted to follow up on to find out how we did not know much about her here. And the coverage starts out in a very friendly manner. The first one says, "Omaha girl takes degree," when she graduated in June of 1911, May or June. She was back visiting her parents who lived here their whole lives. In July, there was another complimentary article about being in Omaha. She'd been out stumping for suffrage, nothing too offensive there. By 1914, the tone of the coverage had changed drastically. And it said that she was after the scalp of US Senator Thomas. He was not from Nebraska, he was from a neighboring state. But just in those 2 years, the tone changed about how they covered her because she was so in favor of the suffrage movement. One of the things politically that made it difficult for people in Omaha anyway to support suffrage was the people that owned the breweries or made liquor were very afraid about women getting the right to vote because they thought that they would be very supportive of prohibition, which passed shortly before the 19th Amendment. So they were really concerned about that issue, and they thought that women would be too sympathetic to supporting and continue to support prohibition. And so that's probably part of the reason that the World Herald started their less than flattering coverage. Her parents also didn't really approve of what she was doing. This is during the picketing time, June of 1917, headline in the World Herald, "One disapproves of suffrage tactics," and that's quoting her mother. On July 15th, Doris sent a telegram back to the World Herald with the subject line, "Stupid." Says Omaha Suff, they abbreviated that for some reason, of picket arrests. So Doris sent the telegram back with "stupid" in the headline, saying, why are you criticizing, why is my mother, or why is anyone in Omaha criticizing me? We're simply trying to exercise our First Amendment rights by picketing the White House, and this is a valuable cause, et cetera, et cetera. So she was definitely at odds with her mother and the World Herald. Around this time, she also met her first husband, Dudley Malone, and we'll talk more about Dudley in a minute. The 19th Amendment did pass and become law very dramatically after Tennessee was the last state to ratify it in 1920. So we'll do a little aside about Dudley here just because he was so interesting. So he was Assistant Secretary of State for the United States government. He was actually quite an ally of Woodrow Wilson, who the suffragists picketed. He had to resign his government positions because he supported suffrage. But he and Doris were almost a tabloid couple. When they got married and subsequently divorced, their marriage was covered on the front page of the World Herald and the front page of the New York Times. So that's how prominent they were. This is very interesting. On December 7th of 1921, Dudley Malone books passage on a ship for two people to go to Europe, but he said he wasn't going to get married. One day later, Miss Stevens and Malone are to be married on Saturday. At this point, the World Herald is calling her a militant suffragist. The sad part about all this is that in an interview with her parents, they said they didn't even know, they'd never met Dudley, and they didn't even know that she was getting married. So she did manage to repair her relationship with her parents, but this was sort of a distant time. Another interesting fact about Dudley, he was not only a prominent attorney, he helped obtain jail releases for some of the suffragists. Doris only spent 2 or 3 days in jail. She was never force-fed, but she did document everything that happened. But Dudley was also part of the Scopes monkey trial. If you remember that from your social studies lessons, when Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution, a high school biology teacher, and he was sort of recruited as a test case. But anyway, a high school biology teacher named John Scopes decided he was going to teach it, and it was sort of a test case. And so the state of Tennessee versus John Scopes was the sensational trial of the day from July 10th to the 21st of 1925. Interestingly, another Nebraska connection, Tennessee brought in William Jennings Bryan, who was one of our native people, native sons, and he represented the state of Tennessee. So he was arguing in defense of literal Bible and teaching creationism. On the other side was the other most famous attorney of his day, Clarence Darrow. And Dudley Malone was what we would call a second chair. He was the other attorney with Clarence Darrow. I read quite a bit about the trial itself, and Dudley Malone gave the closing argument, at the end of the trial where you say, this is why you should find for my client. And both William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow said that Dudley Malone's closing argument in the Scopes monkey trial was the finest courtroom speech that they'd ever heard. And that's high praise because the two of them were really well-known orators back in their day. So he and Doris were married during this time, but it was a really, really unhappy marriage. Whatever they had in common disintegrated pretty quickly. I don't think either one of them stopped seeing other people when they were married, which is a slight problem. They lived in Europe for a while. I mean, anyway, it was not a happy marriage at all. And in general, speaking of marriage, here were Doris's views that I call her avant-garde work on equality and marriage. She never changed her name when she got married, which was unusual in that time. She thought when you got married, you should negotiate a contract with your spouse and that women should be paid for housework, which hasn't worked out. She believed that if you were raising children in the home, that should be considered wage earning. And she was writing and talking about these topics in the mid-1920s. So you can imagine, how out there these views were. What I think really got her sideways with the local crowd was a speech she gave in Omaha in September of 1927. This was in the midst of her divorce from Dudley Malone. And again, it was tabloid coverage, tabloid-ish, but it was in the New York Times, it was in the World Herald. And it was obviously an unhappy time for her. In her papers that she donated to Radcliffe, she you had to prove grounds for divorce in those days, and I think desertion is what she used, but she had about 10 file folders labeled mental cruelty from Dudley. So definitely not a happy union. So she's back in Omaha, she's in the middle of this divorce, it's all over the tabloids type coverage. And in her speech that she gave to the Women's Salvation Army Women's Auxiliary, she essentially told the women in Omaha who had invited her back to sort of like the hometown girl makes good. And in her speech, she essentially told them, you need to really do something with your lives, and you shouldn't just be in an auxiliary, and, kind of like what's wrong with you. And to say that that didn't go over well would be quite the understatement. Here's how it was covered in the World Herald. She was interviewed right before she gave the speech, and she said she might try and study law, which of course didn't work out because Columbia didn't admit women. But she kept being asked by the media, are you going to ask for alimony from Dudley Malone because you thought that women should earn their own money? So there was just a lot going on. She did go back to New York, where she lived most of her adult life, and audited some courses at Columbia Law School and did start writing. But that 1927 speech did not go over well. And I think that is where, in addition to the, bad press coverage she got because she favored suffrage, and then the way they portrayed her through this divorce and some of the other things, that my opinion is that's how she sort of became lost. Her life after Dudley did look up a bit. I mentioned that she worked overseas. When she was arrested in Paris, and they said, aren't you tired of getting arrested? She said, no, it was splendid, and we're so proud of what we're doing. And the British press, of course, were appalled that she was acting like the Pankhurst, and she said, of course we lack tact. We are in revolt. So she maintained her chutzpah, I guess is the way to put it, and really continued working for the things she believed in for quite a while. Her biggest success, this is a picture of her, actually Alice Paul's in this photo too, but she's cropped out. Her biggest success was doing the work with this particular commission and helped to get 2 equality treaties adopted. But political differences led to her removal as chair of that commission. She somehow alienated Eleanor Roosevelt, and I don't know the details of it other than the fact that she was removed from chairing that commission. She had a happy second marriage to a writer named Jonathan Mitchell, again kept her maiden name, lived in New York, but she totally withdrew from public life. She designed book covers. She wrote music that was performed at Constitution Hall, on the radio and at Constitution Hall in DC. She interestingly developed a very strong anti-communist stance, and so she believed in McCarthyism, which was the wrong side of the facts there. But she retired from political activism. She did come back to Omaha to visit. One time when she was back, she noted that she was interviewed by the paper, and she said, I like the Midwest. When I was coming out here on the train, I can't imagine why I ever moved. So she always maintained an appreciation for her hometown, even if she wasn't particularly appreciated here sometimes. The other thing that, in addition to designing the book covers, the other thing that she did was she wrote songs. Some of these songs, as I mentioned, were performed, and others, there's just the sheet music for them. She did donate some of her sheet music and a brief, small amount of papers to the History Nebraska. And so I used those files. And there are audio recordings of some of her songs, which are really fun. Most of them are sentimental and about growing up in Omaha. Here's the title of 3 of her songs. When Father Made Root Beer, I Taught in a One-Room School, and my personal favorite, Lake Manawa. If you've ever been to Lake Manawa, I'm not sure it would inspire you to write songs, but I think that was something that was moving to her back in the day. The last time that she came back to Omaha, it was in the mid 1950s for her 50th high school reunion, and it was covered much more neutrally in the paper. She was remembered as a friendly girl with musical talent, but one of her classmates said she was the most famous feminist of the entire world in the 20th century, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but they did catch the essence of the fact that she really was quite prominent. One of her last visits home was for that reunion. Jailed for Freedom was out of print until 1976 and reissued in 1995. I should add that when I first found out that she was the author, I went to the College of St. Mary Library. So the college has been around since 1923. And I thought, okay, maybe we have a copy of it. And we did. So I went over and got the original Jailed for Freedom, which I don't recommend that's the one you read. But when I opened it, I don't know when the college got it, but this was in, about 2009 or 10. No one had ever checked it out. So she was hidden in the College of St. Mary Library as well. But I've checked it out since then and have had some students do it too. But her later years, she was quite happily married to Mr. Mitchell. He is probably the one who made a lot of the money that was used to endow that endowed professorship at Princeton, because for all of her views about equality, she really wasn't a high wage earner in her day. This is the quote where she says she really likes the Middle West, and that she visited her parents often. There's another picture of Central High School. She also had a 1959 interview with Oberlin that I could find, and she wanted to be listed as a publicist, an organizer for women's rights, and an author. We've already talked about the professorship at Princeton. Doris died on March 24th, 1963 in New York. Her last entry into the World Herald, the headline said, "Omaha-born feminist dies." And so that is one of the better pictures of Doris that I found. So she really came full circle by the time she passed away. She wasn't the militant feminist anymore, but after that 1963 entry in the paper, she was somewhat lost. And so I'm glad that she's been resurrected a bit. Central High School has inducted her into their Hall of Fame. And I published a couple articles about her, and I'm very happy to do these kinds of presentations so that she's not lost to history anymore. So ready for questions?
All right. Well, it was just a great presentation. I really enjoyed hearing so much about her. And the thing that I kept is, I think that some of the viewers know, I directed the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics for 22 years at Iowa State. And Carrie was actually in the middle movement, but she lived much longer than women did at the time. And she died in 1947. So there would be some intersections of their lifetime. And actually, again, as I think we've mentioned before in other presentations, is that the suffrage movement was 72 years long, and it really took these 3 generations of suffrage leaders, most of whom were women, but also men. But I think at the end you have, again, Carrie Chapman Catt, and if you watch Iron Jawed Angels, you'll see this, that she was the more moderate of the group. She was tied with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. At first, the militant women were part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, but they departed because they wanted to do these more militant. And it really is, I think, the fact that you had this more militant movement getting all this attention, as Sally has said, from this jail. I mean, it leaked out to the media, and that there is a line in the movie, and I'm not sure if Carrie ever said this, but it was to Woodrow Wilson saying, "Do you want to deal with me or these militants who are chaining themselves to the White House?" And so, I think if you study social movements, that's what you'll see. It really takes, long social movements, it takes sort of efforts from all sides to get it done. So anyway, super informative presentation. I took lots of notes. I think it's important as we celebrate this century of women's voting and women's right to vote, it's so important to learn about and to acknowledge the work of these 3 generations of suffragists who contributed to the 72-year movement. And certainly Doris Stevens did. So I invite our viewers on Facebook to continue to put questions for Sally in the comment section. I'm now going to turn it over to Mary Yeager of the Humanities Nebraska staff She's going to join us to relay questions from the audience. And if I think of any, I might interject some as well. So Mary, take over, and I look forward, and I'm sure Sally does as well, to your questions.
Thank you, Diane and Sally. This has been so interesting. We do have viewers from around the state watching the program, and I will start with a first question from our friend Ellen out in Alliance. And if you know Sally, does Doris still have family members living in Omaha?
Great question. Not that I've been able to find. Doris did not have any children. She did have 3 siblings. She had a sister, and she had 2 children, and there was no descendants after that. I actually got on Ancestry.com. I like to do genealogy anyway. And so I got on Ancestry.com, and I didn't want to, be like I was stalking somebody on there, but I thought I could find out. But that branch, so her sister's branch, they lived in Elmwood, Nebraska, and that branch sort of died off. One brother didn't have any children. She also had a brother that lived in McCook, Ralph Stevens, and he owned the Stevens Bottling Company. And I found a little bit about that he lived there. He did have some children, but I have not found what happened to like his children's children. That was a little bit more of a dead end. But interestingly, I gave one of these talks a couple of years ago to a Rotary Club, and one member of the Rotary Club came forward. It was just a cute little guy, and he said, I used to sell glass bottles to Ralph Stevens at the Stevens bottling plant. And so I said, well, what happened to him? He said, oh, I don't know. but he knew him. I mean, it's we all sort of know each other. I like that part about living here. So there are no descendants that I have been able to find. When she was inducted into the Hall of Fame at Central High School, they asked me to come accept the information. And so we kept that at the College of St. Mary Library in our archives. And I'll continue to look. And if I find a descendant, I will share all of this with them, but nothing yet.
Thank you. A question from Kim. And Diane, this might be something you will want to address too. Are there records of Nebraska suffragist women? I found a newspaper article from around 1920, tiny small town in Nebraska, where my great aunt was head of the suffragists for that town during election.
There were some. I will just tell the one part that I know. When Doris came back and gave her infamous 1927 speech where she alienated most of the women of Omaha, there were some people who did understand why she spoke the way she did. The most prominent person that I know in Omaha that supported suffrage was Sarah Jocelyn. So if you're familiar with Jocelyn Art Museum, Jocelyn Castle, etc. Beyond that, I'll defer to Diane.
Well, there are, as Sarah Jocelyn, she actually is someone that I came across as well in my research, and there's really not much about it. It's actually on the Jocelyn website, and basically talks about that she supported women's suffrage, and I tried to find out more about it, but certainly they had a wealthy family and they supported the suffrage movement and actually pro-suffrage candidates. And, as you know, from other presentations, is that Nebraska, I think, tried 4 or 5 times. Actually, they tried to be the first territory and then the first state to approve women's suffrage, and finally had limited suffrage in 1917. As far as records on suffragists, the Nebraska Historical Society and the Nebraska History Museum. So the Nebraska History Museum has a wonderful exhibit that I believe is still up, and I think they're back open again on a limited basis. They launched that exhibit, I think it was August of 2019, and I went to the opening, and they have newspaper clippings as well. I think the person asking the question, she's got this newspaper clipping, and I don't know if she wants to know what to do with it, but one of the things I found out just through just some speaking that I've done for Humanities Nebraska is I keep on collecting more and more information on the suffrage movement in Nebraska. And for example, I was recently at the Cass County, I live south of Plattsmouth, and I was in the Cass County Historical Museum. They wanted me, before I spoke to their annual meeting, they invited me to come and look at their suffrage exhibit. And one of the things they had is all these newspaper articles. And so, and it talked about, things like Susan B. Anthony, a national leader in the movement, spoke in Plattsmouth, and they had and everything. So they had that, and I knew that Susan B., of course, she spoke in Hebron and Beatrice and Grand Island. And so there actually is a very rich movement in Nebraska, because the national women's suffrage leaders, which would have been before Doris Stevens' time, this is a part of the movement, is that they really thought Nebraska was going to be the first state to have state suffrage. And so it wasn't. But so I would say, I would say that your local county historical society, if you have a clipping that talks about suffrage, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. Again, one of the things I would really like to find more information on is African-American women in the suffrage movement in Nebraska. There is a clipping that's at the Nebraska History Museum about a suffrage meeting being held in a woman's house. But of course, back then in the newspapers, and Sally probably got through this as well, except for Doris Stevens, who never took her husband's name, but all names in this newspaper article are like Mrs. Jeff Jones, Mrs. So, and Mr. Yeah. And so there was one name in there who I have been able to use in my presentation of a young woman social worker who went by her, who wasn't married. And I've been able to track down some things about her. But again, to the question, I mean, I think that the Nebraska Historical Society has quite a few articles that they've archived on women's suffrage. There's quite a few scholars in the state of Nebraska that have published journal articles on the suffrage movement in Nebraska. So that's a good place to start with the Nebraska Historical Society. If you've got clippings, I would say donate them to your local historical society, because I think that one thing that is happening is that most organizations are continuing the celebration of the 19th Amendment into 2021 because of 2022 kind of, our plans didn't go as perceived in 2020. So.
Okay, question from Holly. We talk about the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, but I have read that Black women weren't able to vote until the 1960s. Was that true in Nebraska?
Well, first I'm going to address that because African-American women could vote in 1920. And again, and actually there is I think one of the most noted African-American women scholars right now is Martha Jones, who's at Johns Hopkins University. She's been featured in a number of suffrage films, PBS, two-part American Experience, and then Iowa PBS did one on Carrie Chapman Catt, and Martha's also in that. And so she has a book that just came out in the fall called Vanguard, and it tells the stories of women in the suffrage movement in 1920. And so what Martha typically says is, would it be true to say that all African-American women could vote in 1920? No, that was not true. But would it be true to say that no African-American women could vote? That also would be not true. And Martha takes the next step, and I think this is important. What she says is, when we say that no African-American women can vote in 1920, which you heard a lot this year, I mean, you heard that a lot, that denies these stories of these women who did vote. Like Mary Bethune McLeod, who actually organized voters in Orlando, Florida. And so anyway, but there were 48 states in 1920, and 14 of them, primarily in the southeastern United States, had barriers to voting that were enacted after the
Jim Crow laws, right?
Yeah, Jim Crow laws. But 34 states did not have any barriers to act. So African-American women could vote where African-American men could vote, but most of them lived in the South. And I don't know, Sally, if you want to add more to that, but.
No, I concur.
Yeah, okay.
So Kim, who asked about the clipping of the relative, did share that she wants to round out her family tree for the rest of her family. So that's kind of from. And so I'll ask you, Sally, in that direction, has researching and speaking about Doris led you to consider doing additional research, or has Doris just been enough for you in that?
It's interesting. I enjoy it thoroughly, and I've always liked to research. But I'm also really enjoying being retired. And so when people would ask me about Doris, if I was going to write a book, she's actually featured as one of 3 women in a book by Mary Trigg, who's a feminist scholar at Rutgers, called Feminism as Life's Work. and she couldn't get enough out of Doris in her life to write a book. And so I'm not sure that there would be enough there without me going to Radcliffe and, you know, sitting in the library all day or whatever. And so the short answer is I'm kind of over myself. I don't know how else to put it. If I was still younger and needed tenure at my college or something, I might write a book. But I have published some about Doris. There's also, and I don't seem to have it with me, I'm looking for it. There's a book that History Nebraska put out called Votes for Women. And it has all of the articles that have been published in the Nebraska History magazine about suffrage. So I have one in there about Doris, and Clara Bewick Colby is in there. So that would be a great book to get. And it's for History Nebraska. It's not the authors, you know, aren't taking the money. So it's not a shameless plug, but it does have a lot of the history of what happened in Nebraska. And then it has my article about Doris and some other things. So that is tied to the exhibit that I think is still open that I haven't been able to go to because of the pandemic. So yeah.
I think that exhibit stays open through a good part of 2021. So hopefully people have the opportunity to see it because it is really something that I think we would all encourage. And I will confess that Nebraska History Votes for Women publication is where I discovered you, Sally.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. Bringing Doris to life. And it's funny, I didn't even know my article was in there, actually. I have a friend that works in the state capitol. She works for the Supreme Court. And she just called and said, hey, I think your article about Doris Stevens is in here. And she knew all about the article because when I was writing it, I hadn't done, you know, endnotes for decades. I know how to do legal research in my sleep. Legal citations, and she heard me complain endlessly about the Chicago Manual of Style, which I'd never done. And so she said, it was worth it. That Chicago Manual of Style, all those endnotes, it was worth it. It's in here. So yeah. And so that I highly recommend that book if you want to know about the history of suffrage in Nebraska.
Wonderful. Another comment, I appreciate these presentations that have resurrected these women who through their persistence, courage, intelligence, and sacrifice have given my life agency. Thanks to these scholars for shining light on these sheroes.
I like that, yeah.
A couple of last things. Sally, Doris really did seem like a woman ahead of her time in many ways. And I wonder with your familiarity with her 100 years later, which of her traits do you think would serve us best today?
Would serve like humanity best today?
Yeah.
I think she spoke truth to power. She was not shy at all. And I think, you know, when she thought it was splendid to be arrested in several countries and, you know, loved the fact that she lacked tact. I actually have a British son-in-law, and when I showed him that quote about the Pankhurst or whatever, he said, oh my, you know, repelling Buckingham Palace. Oh my, that's very un-British. So she really defied convention. And I think she would be a valuable person to, as I said, speak truth to power, you know, when we're still dealing with some of the same things that she spoke about, you know, equal pay and the ability to not change your name if you so choose, which isn't as controversial as it used to be. But I think she would be out with a picket somewhere and still asking for equality.
Someone did note a correction that the Votes for Women exhibit at Nebraska History Museum is on display only through January 2nd of 2021. So
okay,
as
all
long,
right,
maybe they'll prolong it.
Maybe. I mean, I might try and, you know, put my hazmat suit on and come down and see it.
And another question, not that it matters, but I'm curious, was Doris a Republican or a Democrat?
I think she was I think she was a Republican, and her McCarthyism, which is not the best part of her life story, was her passion in the 50s. I didn't get into that. I was more focused on her Omaha upbringing or whatever. So I have no idea what sent her in that direction, except that I think Jonathan Mitchell may have leaned in that direction as well. But I think she was a registered Republican. And I think that's probably the way she got sideways with Eleanor Roosevelt too, and got booted from the Inter-American Commission that she chaired.
Yeah, the Republican Party actually supported suffrage before the Democratic Party.
Oh, yes, yes.
So Carrie Chapman Catt also was rumored to be a Republican, but was more willing to work with both parties, Democrat and Republican, where it was kind of interesting because when Doris would have been chaining herself to that they were very anti-Wilson, where, Catt tried to work with them. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe it switched around that time, but it was interesting too, because Carrie Chapman Catt was very much in the good blesses of Eleanor Roosevelt and even received awards from her. So I'm going to check into one of the things you talked about today, Sally, because Carrie Chapman Catt was also involved in the international women's suffrage movement before and after heading the final campaign here. And she turned to international suffrage and peace work after the 19th Amendment. But she was part of some of these international organizations. And I don't know if they were the ones that Doris was involved in, but that's something I'm certainly going to check out, because she was involved with several of these big international organizations after suffrage, after the 19th Amendment here. I have a question for Sally. Is there time for me to ask one, Mary?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just curious, do you know if Doris Stevens was in Nashville or Tennessee when the 19th Amendment, because one of the things I read a lot, and of course, Carrie Chapman Catt had a bunch of money from a publisher in New York. And so she had the money to take the National American Women's Suffrage Association down. And by that point in time, there was some animosity between Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. And I know, and one of the things I've read is that the National Women's Party really couldn't afford to send people there, but they certainly had people on the ground that were affiliated with the National Women's Party.
Yes, I'm just finishing Elaine Weiss's book, The Women's Hour, which focuses on the ratification in Tennessee. Doris is not mentioned in her very thorough book at all. Jailed for Freedom is mentioned in her book, but I don't think Doris was there. Doris's one of her jobs was to keep Alva Belmont happy and still funding things. So she may have been working as her secretary in those days. I don't know, but no, she didn't get to Tennessee, to the best of my knowledge, which is too bad, because I've been waiting for her to pop up in Elaine's book, and she hasn't yet. So
no, she hasn't. No, I've read that too. So yeah.
So no, but Jailed for Freedom, bless her for writing that. Mm-hmm. It is. She did use that for the background about the picketing and everything that happened.
Yeah. Well, I'll just end the Q&A with a comment from the audience. They've really enjoyed the presentations, love learning about Nebraska heroes that we didn't know about before, and says she has strong feelings about our Nebraska history books, leaving out the women heroes.
And I'll just briefly say that I used to ask my students, did any of you learn this in high school? No. And I'll say, well, why don't you think you did? And their answers were everything from sweet, well, maybe they just didn't have time to put everything in the book, to more thoughtful, like, that's a good point. I'm like, think about how many wars you studied, and so what I tried to say was, if you ever have input on, we trained many teachers, and I said, if you ever have input on what's included in curriculum, this is a big story. And I think, other than Susan B. Anthony, none of my students had heard of any of these other women. And so hopefully the next generation is getting more clued in, and they will make sure that some of this is actually covered in future social studies classes. So. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Diane. Thanks to our audience members, and want to thank Christy and Sherilyn behind the scenes. I want to, we have, so we've been doing a drawing after each of our programs, and our first winner got the Iron-Jawed Angels DVD that you mentioned. Today's drawing winner is Ruth Ann, and she'll be getting a copy of Clara Colby, the International Suffragist. It's a new book published in 2019 by John Holliday of Australia. I think he's a distant relative who got interested in her story. Next week, we will be drawing for Jailed for Freedom, the book that you mentioned, Sally. Hopefully it's the right edition.
Oh, they're both good. I just think the edited version a little less of the, and then I was mad at her.
So if you're interested in signing up for the next book's drawings or reminders about our upcoming programs, be sure to register at humanitiesnebraska.org/vote. On Thursday, we'll have the last in our series of women's suffrage programming, and this will be a panel on women in politics today. We'll be joined by State Senator Anna Wishart, Sarpy County Election Commissioner Michelle Andal, Voter Services Director for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, Tony Monet, and Diane Bystrom, co-president of the Nebraska League of Women Voters. Just want to end by saying that Humanities Nebraska's mission is to help Nebraskans explore what connects us and makes us human. We're funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, private donations, and appropriation from the Nebraska Legislature and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, a public-private partnership with state dollars matching private dollars to benefit the arts and humanities in Nebraska. And today is Giving Tuesday, so if you're so inclined, be sure to get out there and support your favorite arts and humanities organizations. And with that, we will end the program and hope to see you on Thursday.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.